my name is Kristen and this is Kristen Cray's Book. I honestly believe that April was the best reading month I've had in such a long time, maybe ever. I read 13 books in April, which is pretty standard, but 5 of them were 5 stars, which is so unusual for me, especially this year. I feel like I haven't been getting that many 5 stars, but in April I read so many. And I'm going to talk about all the books that I read from order of my least favorite up to my favorite. But once we get to the 5 stars, it's going to be hard for me. And honestly, I didn't dislike or hate any of the books I read this month. Some weren't my favorites. There's some 3 stars here, but nothing terrible. So overall, a really, really exciting and great reading month for me. I think I read almost 6,000 pages. Some really big standouts, some that are outside of my comfort zone. So let's talk about them. And sadly, as is the curse of book clubs, my most disappointing book of the month was the Checkout Book Club's book for March, but I read it in April, and it wasn't a bad book, it just was not my favorite. So this is Song of Blood and Stone by L. Penelope. Now keep in mind there are 3 editions of this book. There was a self-published version, then it got picked up and the author added more to the story, and then the paperback version, she added even more. And this is the paperback version, but I listened to the audiobook, which was a different version. So it's all very confusing, and I do wonder if I would have liked it more had I read this tome, but it was so big and I wasn't as invested in it, so I just listened to the audiobook. But Kate from Kate Coy, who is part of the book club, really enjoyed this, and she is the one that read this full thing. So who knows, I will leave a link to the live show discussion down below. It's all very confusing because of the different editions, but it was really interesting to unpack that all because all of us read different editions of it. So really interesting. The world in this could have been really cool. I loved the opening prologue, and I think the problem with this is I had gone into it expecting an epic fantasy. That's what it is billed at. If you go on Goodreads, it says the start of an epic fantasy series. This is a fantasy romance, especially the version I read. The relationship between our 2 characters is front and center. It is first love for both of them, and a lot of their interactions are honestly cringy for me and awkward and uncomfortable, especially like the steamy scenes were just kind of to me. But the whole world was fascinating. The conversations about refugees I really liked, and I think that in this final version that is commented on even further, and we get more about immigration in that story than we did in the version that I got. So I don't know, it's really hard to even talk about this book because we're not all having the same reading experience, not just because every reader reads a book differently, because every book is different, 3 different versions. So I don't know. Yeah, it was an interesting experience to say the least. I will leave the live show down below, as I said, but if you have read this, let me know your thoughts on it and which version of this you read. I don't think I'll be continuing on with the series, but I will be curious to watch everybody else in the Discord who decides to read it, and I will be spying on their conversations. Next up is How to Kill Men and Get Away with It, and this was a really, really interesting book. It is definitely satirical. It is a mix of Killing Eve and Dexter. We're following a woman who is a social media influencer, but she's also comes from money, and she recognizes the privilege that she has. She hates being an influencer, but she doesn't do anything to change it, and she really takes advantage of the fact that she has all this money and wealth and prestige and stuff. So she's a frustrating character to read about. You're never gonna like her through the story, but you root for her. So she's walking home from a night out, and somebody she met at the bar follows her home, and she accidentally kills him. She realizes that she got some enjoyment out of that, so she goes about killing terrible men. And let's just say the way that her family has made their money plays into it, and she gets very creative with this, and it's all taking place on page. So if that's too much for you, I wouldn't pick this up. We get all the gory details and all the satisfaction that she gets from it, but it's definitely satirical and dark humor. So if you like dark humor, I might try this one. And then she also has a romance that I was kind of rooting for, and I was very conflicted by. So it's just a very strange book, one that I continue to think about because it doesn't sit right with me in a lot of ways, but it wasn't supposed to, and there's some really interesting twists by the end. Yeah, so I don't know, that was an interesting reading experience for me, but I am glad that I picked it up. Then we have the Fiance Farce by Alexandra Bellafleur, this is my first book by her. I'm curious to try more. I really enjoyed this. It just wasn't my favorite, but I will say that the communication in this book was next level. I don't think I've ever read such great communication in a romance, but maybe that made this a little boring for me. maybe it's too healthy of a relationship and it was just not that exciting to read about. And I think part of the problem is that with fake dating, there's such a fine line between like too much pining, too much like you both like each other, stop pretending you don't, just talk, and them talking too soon and the fake dating doesn't really happen. And I think that this falls into the latter, where they agreed to this marriage of convenience, but very early on decide to give this a chance because they're so attracted to each other. So it doesn't feel like a marriage of convenience anymore. So the whole trope that I picked this up for and was expecting, I didn't really get. I did appreciate that a lot of their conflicts come from the outside. I prefer that in my romance, where external issues and people around you can affect your relationship, and I feel like that's realistic. So I appreciated that about it. Some of it was silly, like, I can't get too much into it, but there's a scene where they try and get revenge in this, and I just kind of thought that was silly. I wish they had done more. That person deserved more than what he got, but yeah. Yeah, it was cute. I liked both characters. I thought they had great chemistry. It was just kind of boring for me simply because maybe they talk too much. Maybe it's too healthy and that's just not what I want to read about. So I don't know what that says about me, but there you go. I cannot believe that I read this in April. It feels so long ago, but I did read Ocean's Echo by Everina Maxwell, which is the sequel technically to Winter's Orbit, but it's more of a companion novel. It's not talking about the same characters. They're not even mentioned. It's just set in the same world, which I do think is interesting because I liked the world that Everina Maxwell created in Winter's Orbit. I like the politics, and while the first book I adored and is really focused on the romance, this one does have a romance in it. That's more in the background. The politics are really at play in this one, so I think it really just depends on who you are as a reader, what you expect from this book. But if you expect the same level of romance from the first book, I think this one will be disappointing. And even the politics weren't as interesting to me as in the first book, but I did like it. We follow a character whose aunt has a lot of power and she wants him to sharpen up, so she forces him to join the military. And then his love interest is somebody who is in the military and is tasked with guarding him, but he doesn't like the fact that this character didn't join the army by choice, that he was forced into it. So there's some like almost fake, it's not fake dating, but fake connection that happens in here. You'll have to read it to understand that. I thought was actually an interesting plot point. Then we get a lot of political stuff. We're all over the place. It was fun. It was probably too long for me. I think it was over 450 pages, and I wish more of the pages were given to the romance, I will say, because I think the middle was kind of slow, but overall I had a good time with it. It was fun. I've been stalking Everina Maxwell's Goodreads and stuff, trying to see what she is going to write next because I want more. I then read my first nonfiction book of 2023, which is just pathetic. Sad for me. Normally I have read 5 or 6 by now, but I just have been on a fiction mood. I don't know what that is about, but I finally made time for nonfiction because for Realmathon I was Team Ilma, and technically that is sci-fi and nonfiction, so I figured this was a good excuse to throw nonfiction in there. So I listened to Invisible Women, which is a nonfiction that has been around for a while. I think it came out in 2017 or 2018, and I wish I had read it at the time because I have a feeling with nonfiction like this, it kind of becomes aged, like the stats. I don't know that they're all the same, but I think that the commentary and everything that we learned is current and something that is frustrating to read about. This is a book I think you need somebody in your real life or online to talk about with because you want to get your frustrations out. It's really focusing on how the world works against women. Something as simple as when the buses run or when the streets are cleaned. That was all very, very eye-opening for me. It talks about how a lot of the drugs that we take are not tested on women, they're tested on men, how like car safety, all the dummies are men and things like that. So the world is just not as safe for women as it is for men, which I think we all acknowledge and realize, but this really gives you the facts and it's frustrating. But something I would recommend trying. And if you have anything similar to this, let me know because I'd be interested to read more because I think this is a good starting point for this conversation. I then read a horror novella by Mira Grant, and those are becoming some of my favorite things. I love her short form horror, and this was actually the prequel to Into the Drowning Deep. This is called Rolling in the Deep, and now that song's gonna be stuck in my head. I kept singing that entire song as I was reading this, but it's not lighthearted. This is definitely a horror. If you've read Into the Drowning Deep, you know the history of this. So we're talking about a ship that went out on an expedition in the sea and never returned, and maybe there were killer mermaids. And I think reading this prequel helped me understand Into the Drowning Deep more. I will get to that. I did read that in April as well, but it helped me with the science stuff because it is science fiction. There's a lot of science that goes into this, and I think reading that prequel helped me understand, but it does kind of spoil some things. So I think you could go either way with it, though I believe that the prequel came first, that Mary Grant wrote this novella first and then made the full-length novel out of it. So yeah, I'm happy I read it. I don't think it was even on my radar, and then somebody in my comments asked me if I was going to read the prequel, and I thought, oh, I should probably do that. And thank you to that commenter, because I think it helped my enjoyment of the whole thing overall. I then read Record of a Spaceborne Few by Becky Chambers. This is the third book in the Wayfarer series, and it's my least favorite in the series, but it's still fantastic. I gave it 4 stars, or 4.25, I would say. The problem with this one is it focuses on the humans, and the humans just aren't as interesting to me. Humans in space, yeah, it's interesting, but we've read that a million times. Why the humans are in space, yeah, I like that in the other books. I don't know that I really cared as much about them as the other characters that we get in different books, but I was still glad that I read it. I think I understood why Becky Chambers wrote a book like this. All her books that I have read, I've read everything she's ever written at this point, but all of her books are kind of a commentary on humanity and the problems of humanity. So I'm not at all surprised that she wrote a book focusing on humans in space. This actually had a lot of heart. Just like in the other books, we follow different characters. They're all on like this space shuttle where humans have inhabited, and they're building their own cultures, and actually we get characters of different species that visit for the first time, and they are in awe and kind of confused by humans in general. So I think that's kind of funny and sweet. So it has a charm of this entire series, but also some commentary on humanity and how humans think and how kind of strange we are. So yeah, I thought this was fun, and there were some perspectives I loved more than others, but that is always going to be true, and just not my favorite of the bunch, but still a really great read. And now Into the Drowning Deep. I really loved this book. This is a full-length novel from Mary Grant. It is like horror, thriller, sci-fi. It's such a unique book, and I don't think you need to go into this knowing anything other than it's the same thing. It's these characters, they're scientists, and they're looking into what happened to the ship from the prequel all those years ago, and they want answers. And a lot of people on board have different reasons for wanting answers, and you learn that. And then there's killer mermaids, and it gets gory in some points. It doesn't hold back, but it's also thrilling, because I think a lot of the scare factor for me was the tension of not knowing when the mermaids were going to show up. And there's a lot of science in here. The ending kind of blew my mind. So yeah, this is really memorable. I highly recommend it. I know a lot of people have read this already, but I just got to it, and I think this is a good moment to remind you that Once Upon a Readathon is happening next month. And one of the ways to earn points is to either join Team Mermaids and you get 50 points for being a mermaid, or if you join Team Dragons or Team Jinn, which is my team and you should join, if you read a mermaid book, you can attack the mermaid team. And I highly recommend doing that with Into the Drowning Deep and the prequel as well. Okay, now we're getting into the 5 stars. So this is where it gets difficult for me, but I think I'm gonna go with Radiance next. This is by Grace Draven. This is like the start of my love of fantasy romance. I'm really getting into it now. I'm reading Blood Mercy as we speak, and it's just kind of where I'm at the moment. But this is following 2 characters who are in an arranged marriage, and they are completely different species, and they find each other hideous. They think that they are completely ugly, and they meet and they talk about how ugly each other is, but they have such great banter that they kind of have a connection, and they're happy to be married to one another. She's happy to leave her village and where she's grown up because she's never felt really loved there. He's happy to have a wife and to have his own life separate from his family as well. And there's a lot of great politics happening, especially around his family and his mother. And the way that she responds to everybody kind of looking at her strangely, it's just, I loved it. I loved it. It's slow burn because honestly, we see their attraction grow as it goes on. And it's just, I had so much fun with it. I'm going to be reading the sequel this month. It was just kind of ridiculous in that way, but really serious at times too, and a really interesting world. Loved these characters, loved their banter, loved their romance, can't wait for more. And then I finally finished or caught up with the Murderbot Diary series, and I read the full-length novel, Network Effect, And here I was putting it off thinking, oh well, I love Murderbot as a novella. I don't know if Murderbot can carry a full-length novel, if it'll get annoying for me. No, this is my favorite book in this series. I thought that this was so much fun, and I think a lot of people probably had the same hang-ups I have. So if you are like me, trust me, Murderbot can carry their own novel, did a fantastic job. I loved every second of it. We get some, I don't want to say anything more, but it just brought me so much joy. Some appearances that happened brought me joy. I was laughing a lot. I just thought this was incredible. It had everything that I love about Murderbot. Made me that much more excited for Systems Collapse, which is another full-length novel we're getting later in the year. I hope the series never stops. I don't know when the last book is coming or if this is the last book. I hope it's not. I'm gonna have to look that up, but I hope the series continues because Murderbot just never gets old to me. Next we have Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, and no, you're not having deja vu. I read this in January, loved it, talked about it a lot, put it in many recommendation videos, but I reread it in April for the Femmes Aficionados book club and had a live discussion, and we all adored it, so I will leave that linked down below. But I think I love this even more upon a reread. Knowing where it was going, I just thought that this was perfect for me. I went into it knowing some of the critiques people have about it, thinking that the love interest is selfish, but I just couldn't see it. I tried to see it, couldn't see it, especially if you know how this ends up. It makes sense the way that our love interest is. So I don't know, I just thought this was fantastic. If you've read Memoirs of Lady Trent, that kind of character, that kind of setup, but I love this one more. And we're following Emily Wilde, obviously, who is a scholar, and she has gone to this like Nordic village to observe these fairies. She doesn't want to get involved with the community at all, but she's kind of forced to, and then her friend from work that she can't stand, or so she says, turns up, and it all goes from there. And I just loved it, and I like this kind of fairy. Give me this kind of fairy. I don't tend to love like really swoon-worthy fairies. I like the kinds of fairies that we get in here that are being studied. They're a bit darker and more sinister. I loved this approach to fairies, so I need more of this, and if you have any recommendations, let me know. We are getting a sequel to this in January. The covers for the US edition is out. At least I'm going to put that up here so you can see how pretty that is, and yeah, so I'm so happy that I reread this because I loved it even more. Two more. So we have The Galaxy and the Ground Within by Becky Chambers. This is the final book in the Wayfarer series. I have finally completed the series. I read A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet in 2018. Loved it, became an all-time favorite book. And as is my way, or was my way, because I am now finishing series, I never went on with the series. So I finished it this year, loved it. It is an all-time favorite series for me. I recognize why it wouldn't work for everybody. It is very slice of life. It is very hopeful. It's kind of funny and light and doesn't take itself too seriously. It's not your traditional sci-fi, so I understand that this is for a specific audience, but I loved it. And actually that book was my introduction to sci-fi, so I'm always kind of chasing that kind of book now. And between the first book and this one, I couldn't pick a favorite. This one might be my favorite. They're just both fantastic. And this one follows a character who we meet in the first book, and I really loved seeing that character's story and how that all progressed, because I've been curious about them throughout the entire series, so I was happy to see them again. And this one I think is just the sweetest. It is about all of these characters from different cultures and species and communities who have never interacted before and have different prejudices against each other, who are kind of forced to be together when I don't know what they call it in this. It's called Garo, so it's kind of like a refuel station, and there's some kind of technological issues that happen and they can no longer leave, and they are forced to be together and they have to interact with one another, and it's just really sweet. And I just thought that this was the most charming, probably. It's on the shorter side as well, and it was a perfect way to end the series for me. So yeah, I'm so happy that this series brought me so much joy, because I was really hoping that it would after my feelings of the first book, and I think this is a series I would turn to time and time again. So happy that I finally completed this series and loved it. And then finally we have my favorite book of the month, probably my favorite book of the year so far, Ashes of the Sun by Django Wexler. This was just so much fun. When I put this down, I tried to read other things and I couldn't, so spoiler for my May wrap-up, I've already read the sequel because I had to be back with these characters. I loved these characters so much, even when they were frustrating. So we are following a brother and a sister, and they each have a POV, which I liked. I really liked the audiobook as well. And they were separated when they were children. Maya was taken by the government to be trained as a centaur, and Geyer, her brother, has been angry about this ever since and has been looking for revenge from that day on. It really tore his family apart. So it's about them on opposing sides and having different agendas. Maya has a romance that I really liked with a character named Bex, and she is not your typical love interest because she is kind of awkward and quirky, and I love that about her. And I thought that her and Maya had like a really sweet connection and interaction. And then Geyer kind of has a romance with the character that had to grow on me. I'm still not sure about. And just reading about their different motives and agendas was such a good time for me. I just flew through this book. Loved every second of it. The easiest 5 stars I've given so far this year. And yeah, you need to read this. Even if it's scary for you like it was for me, it's so accessible. I think it's one that I would recommend to people looking to get into fantasy. This is a good one to try. So there we have it. Those are all of the books that I read in April. If you've read any of these, I would love to know your thoughts on them. Let me know what the best book you read in April was. I would love to talk about it. Once again, thank you for your support. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.